Good evening everyone. Welcome back to the NPTEL online course Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. We have already completed quite a lot of lectures for this course, and by now I hope that all of you have a very good understanding about tribal communities, and also learning a lot of new things about the communities, the complexities, and the intricacies of studying a community. Now, in the last class, we began with a new field or a new theme, that is on the issue of resources, and we have specifically looked at the question of land. Now, today we will continue with resource rights or resources, and we will be doing forests. Now, many a times since we are talking about within the broad theme of resource, you will see that there is a lot of overlapping also, land, forest, or in the next lecture we will be talking about water. So, in the context of land, we have specifically focused on the nature of land ownership in tribal society, which we have said that it is predominantly defined by communal system of ownership, and this began to gradually change with the coming of the British, particularly because the colonial state only knows one form of property ownership, that is the private property. Now, the introduction of new laws and regulations during the colonial rule have had a significant impact and consequences on tribal communities, and this one of the serious consequences was in terms of dispossession, or sometimes we call it land alienation. Now, for a community who are entirely dependent on land for a livelihood, or also for a community whose socio-cultural life, all of the people are being intricately connected to land, it created a lot of disruption, not only in terms of economically, but in terms of socially, culturally as well. So, therefore, when it comes to forests as well, the issue is quite the same, in a sense that tribal communities' understanding of the forest is very, very different, sometimes very, very distinct. So, in Jharkhand, for example, people have a very close relationship with forests. Forests are not only providers in terms of economically. Forests are also source of beliefs, right? Their socio-cultural beliefs are deeply rooted in the surrounding. Now, in the context of tribal communities like Khasis in Meghalaya, you will also see that there are certain forests which are treated as sacred. You are not allowed to take anything out of the forest, because that is something which is not allowed. Now, in across India, you will see that there are variations in terms of the beliefs associated with forests, what forest means to the communities, but then you will see that the communities don't only look at forests from an economic point of view, which is essentially to extract resources such as timber, such as different kind of fruits, or different kind of saleable products, natural products from forests. The community view forests as a provider, or whose socio-cultural beliefs are also deeply rooted or revolve around forest itself. So, today we will try again like land, we will try to look at the kind of legislation, the kind of changes that has happened in the last 100 years or more, and particularly in relation to forests, and how this has altered or impacted tribal communities. Now, in India today, if you look at tribal communities, it is not that not only tribal communities are the one who are dependent on forests. There are many communities who are dependent on forests, but then when it comes to tribal communities, the issue is quite significant, because at least 75% of the total tribal population in India are directly or indirectly dependent on forests. They are dependent on forests for fruits, for flowers, shelter, medicinal purpose, for monetary income such as firewood and non-timber produces. So, when it comes to the ecological history in India, particularly in the context of tribes, their sustenance, they are primarily forest dependent. Now, for a community like 75% of the entire tribal population being forest dependent, you can see that they are heavily dependent on forest resources for their livelihood, for their everyday survival. Now, it is often argued to have been largely unregulated and exercise relative autonomy over forest produces. So, before at least till the coming of the colonial rule, the tribal communities have a strong relationship with forests, and there was this unrestricted access to forests. So, in terms of governing the forest, they have relative autonomy. They have relative autonomy when it comes to accessing the forest, or when it comes to utilizing forest resources. Ecological and social changes are interdependent, and as such any ecological change would affect the socio, cultural and economic aspects of tribal communities. Now, for any tribal communities, there is this strong symbiotic relationship between nature and their culture. For instance, I am not saying that there is this harmonious relationship between the community and culture. So, I have said this in my previous lectures as well. But the point being that like I said, taking the examples of tribal communities in say Jharkhand or even in Meghalaya, now any kind of changes that happens in the forests particularly have adverse consequences not only for the economic well-being of the community, but also in terms of the socio-economic as well as the belief systems. So, forests were often reserved and regulated during different regimes such as reserve elephant forests during Mauryan Empire or monopoly over commercial forest produces. Overall, the state control over forests was limited and largely restricted. Now, in the pre-colonial period, definitely different empires, different kingdoms have their own set of rules and regulations when it comes to governing the forest. But then the manner, so it was not that they were trying to exert full authority, full sovereignty over control of the forest. So, there was some semblance of autonomy that communities have and enjoy when it comes to accessing forest resources. There was a notable or radical shift in the interdependence of forests and communities, particularly with the coming of the colonial rule. The political dominance and use of technological innovation of extracting resources facilitated the utilization of resources, forest resources and subsequent loss of rights of forest dependent communities. Now, by virtue of being in power and by virtue of being politically dominant, the Britishers have began to gradually transform the forests as state resources and began to view forests as as a means to extract profit or to extract resources, which in turn facilitated a change in terms of the way in which forest resources were being used. And what it means for the local communities such as the tribal communities was that it resulted into the gradual loss of their rights in terms of accessing forest resources. Now, let us look at the colonial rule. Some of the colonial legislations that were being introduced by the colonial state are continued to enforced even till today. And therefore, it is very important to historicize this problem. Now, even in India also, if you are interested to really understand the environmental history of India, you cannot but look at how the colonial state was trying to regulate and govern forests, because India was India have a vast amount of forest resources, and for the colonial state it was very important to tap into and make the most use of it when it comes to forests in India. So, the monopoly over large tract of forests throughout the subcontinent is what created this juncture between the past and colonial history. For instance, around 20% of land area of India was under forest department during colonial period. Now, the colonial state began to introduce new laws and legislations, new institutions, and one of them was the forest department. And now, in a short span of time, the entire forest land out of at least 20% of the forest land was brought under the forest department. Now, it essentially means that when these forest lands were being brought under forest department, it means that communities no longer have the right to access to this forest, and it belongs to the colonial state. The focus of colonial intervention in the ecological history of India was primarily on resource exploitation or commercialization rather than environmental protection. Now, it is a common knowledge that the British primarily came to India to economically exploit the country. So, therefore, it is not surprising that they have no interest in terms of environmental protection when it comes to resources like forests. Now, so therefore, the primary intention of the colonial state in terms of its action in relation to forests is basically exploitation and commercialization. For instance, in the northern part of India, in the Himalayan region, the Himalayan mixed coniferous forests were transformed into coniferous, while Western Ghats were transformed into teak forests. Now, forests in India, were very mixed in terms of the kind of trees that they were being grown, in terms of the kind of resources that one could expect. But different kinds of particular kinds of trees were being promoted, such as in Western Ghats the entire forest was gradually being transformed into teak, essentially because there was this commercialization of forest lands, commercialization of forest resources. Now, from viewing forests as natural resources, the transformation that we see during the colonial period was this commercialization of forest resources. The political dominance over the subcontinent, it allowed the British to introduce different laws and regulations, and also have control over large tract of forests. The forest laws and regulations, one of the important regulations that was introduced was the Indian Forest Act of 1865, which specifically brought forests under state authority and empowered state to declare any land with trees, bushes as forests. And in 1878, the Indian Forest Act, which was introduced by the colonial state, divided forests into reserve, protected and village, promulgated during colonial rule, were mainly to ensure consistent and rationalized production of teak and timbers. Now, teak and timbers essentially because during the high period of colonialism, we know that the colonial state was creating a lot of infrastructure that will enable and enhance the accumulation, right. Now, for example, in India, the construction of railways. Now, for constructing railways, they require train sleepers. So, therefore, to enable that, they have to do something, and that was indirectly linked to the transformation of forests that we see with the introduction of teak and timbers during the colonial rule. Now, what does these laws and legislations do? These laws and legislation actually snatch away the rights of people over access to forests. At the same time, what it does is also that the colonial state is declaring itself as the sole authority of forest resources in India. This rationalized timber production could only be ensured through the strict regulation of traditionally exercised rights. In the Indian Forest Act of 1878, its family of right holders was allotted a specific quantum of timber and fuel, while sale or barter of forest produce was strictly prohibited. This exclusion from forest management was therefore both physical, denying or restricting access to forests and pasture, and social, allowing right holders only a marginal and inflexible claim on the produce of the forest. So, the regulation of forests, which was introduced through these different kind of laws, particularly the Indian Forest Act, was to even actually monitor or even actually decide how much a family of people who are actually forest dependent should be allowed to access and utilize forest resources. Now, what it was trying to actually, the message essentially is that the forests can no longer be accessed openly and easily without the knowledge of the colonial state. And for even people, individuals, families, communities who are entirely dependent on forests, their access to forest resources are being monitored, are being regulated. The Indian Forest Act 1878 created a distinction between agriculture and forest, where it excluded the agricultural population from the forest management. So, therefore, there was this systemic exclusion of people in forest management. So, over a period of time, what we see was that community claims and rights over forest resources gradually was being denied. So, therefore, people were no longer allowed to have access to forests. People were no longer being made part of any kind of forest management. So, communities relying on the collection of fruits and hunting, particularly from tropical regions, were the ones who faced the direct brunt of the colonial forest regulations. Hunting and gathering were declared illegal, and the communities practicing it were denied any kind of monopoly over forest produce. Now, why is this issue of collecting fruits, collecting fruits and hunting relevant in the context of tribal society? Now, that many tribal communities are forest dependent. Now, hunting, for instance, is something which is very, very common. It was it was practiced much before the coming of the British. Now, for many tribal communities, it is part of hunting is something which is quite intrinsic to the socio-cultural life of the people. Now, with the coming of the British, tribal communities were no longer allowed to hunt freely in the forest. So, therefore, gradually the people who have actually have close relationship with forests, people who have been utilizing forest resources, people who went to hunting in the forest are being gradually turned as encroachers when it comes to forest resources. So, this is one of the severe implications that the colonial state and regulations have done when it comes to forest resources in the context of tribal communities. So, to cite an example, the Chenchus, who were hunter and gatherers, lost their rights, and in some places they were placed in large settlements, as mobile communities were often seen as threat to the colonial government. Now you know that tribal communities are very, very diverse. Many communities have practice settled cultivation. Many have are practicing Zoom cultivation, that is Sweden cultivation or shifting cultivation. At the same time, many tribal communities are also pastoral communities. Many tribal communities are also nomadic communities, in a sense that they continually migrate from one place to the other. Now this form of continual periodic migration, which was being practiced by many tribal communities, was viewed as a threat by the colonial state. Likewise, in regions where practice of Zoom cultivation was the predominant mode of agriculture owing the hilly terrains, this was also this practice of Zoom cultivation also began to be severely impacted by the colonial forest laws. Now Zoom cultivation for the colonial state, the Britishers began to see this practice of Zoom cultivation as destructive to environment. What tribals are doing is that they are burning down forests and then cultivating the land for 4 or 5 years, and then after that they will move to some other place. So that is why it is known as shifting cultivation. Now these forest laws actually began to curtail the practice of Zoom cultivation of tribal societies, and this curtailment came along with the representation, this manufacturing of Zoom cultivation as something which is ecologically destructive, economically unviable, economically unproductive. So however, for the tribal communities, Zoom cultivation was not only a mode of production, it was also guided by values such as communal labor and adhering to the allotted land as a respect to the tradition. Now every family, the community will come together, and it was not that people who are more powerful, people who are more influential will get vast amount of land. Sometimes every community have their own ways of distributing land. Sometimes they will do lottery, sometimes they will look at the number of family, the number of members within the family, and then they will take decisions on the basis of that okay, this family will take this patch of land, this family will take that patch of land. In terms of the distance also, they used to decide collectively. Now this is a system that is being widely practiced. So therefore and many a times it is not that every individual, every family are only engaged in cultivation in their own lands. There is something known as communal labor, where there is a lot of integration that is happening across families, across clans, across skins to help each other out in terms of weeding, in terms of plowing, in terms of even burning down forests, right, to start the process of cultivation. Now, but however, there was this incessant portrayal of Zoom cultivation as destructive, and it was discouraged by the colonial state for multiple reasons. One was that the Britishers brought a sharp contrast between the plough cultivation and Zoom cultivation, where Zoom cultivation was discouraged as it was seen as primitive and unremunerative form of agriculture. Now, like I said, the Britishers began to make these two distinctions between people who practice settled cultivation. Now settled cultivation for them is something which is more modern, which is more productive, but whereas Zoom cultivation was relegated as primitive, economically unviable and destructive for the environment, because it involves burning down forests, and then after a period of time the communities have to move to a new patch of land, right. So therefore the colonial state began to actually portray the practice of Zoom cultivation as something that is very, very negative. Areas cultivated under Zoom cultivation often were the reserves of most valued quality of timber species, creating a conflict of interest between the commercial interest of the Britishers in forest and Zoom cultivation. But unfortunately, like I said, tribal communities inhabit one of the most resource-rich regions in India, including forests. Now these areas where Zoom cultivation was practiced by the communities also happen to be areas which have one of the most high valued quality of timber species. Now for the colonial state, they need to find reason as to why these communities should be prevented from continuing this practice of Zoom cultivation, because they see that it is hurting their commercial interests. So they begin to portray the practice of Zoom cultivation in an evil manner. They continue to project it as something which is negative, which is environmentally destructive. So there is this purport, there is this intentional creation of or manufacturing of Zoom cultivation as ecologically destructive, economically unremunerative. So the burning of forest patches were against the commercial interests of the Britishers, and consequently the Zoom was held to be the most destructive of all practices for the forest. Now the colonial state have created this image very intentionally to only serve their commercial interests. Now, even in post-colonial India, many people, it's still something which is being highly debated, and it is not that Zoom cultivation is only cultivated in India. Many indigenous communities in India continue to practice Zoom cultivation. If you go to Southeast Asia also, you will see that Zoom cultivation is widely practiced by indigenous communities. Now, everywhere in the world, Zoom cultivation is always viewed as environmentally destructive. But then in the context of India, you will see that one can historicize where these ideas emanates, where these ideas began to emerge. It was essentially from the colonial period, where the Britishers, by due to their economic interest, began to project Zoom cultivation as something that is ecologically destructive. So, in their attempt to contain the practice of Zoom cultivation while keeping in mind the commercial interest, a reserve was established for tribal communities like the Baigas. The impact of territorial restriction and overall discouragement of Zoom was immediately seen in the cultural loss among the Baigas, who in a petition to the British government said. Now, the Baigas are very important, because it was the Baigas, it was Varial Elwin actually who have written about the Baigas, and the Baigas actually was a reflection of Varial Elwin love for tribal communities in India, and it is a very fascinating monograph that Elwin has written on the Baigas. Now, this coming back to the issue of Zoom cultivation, the practice of Zoom cultivation was still trying to curtail it. The colonial state was trying to curtail it, and for which they began to demarcate a specific region, territory as reserve, so that communities like the Baigas can continue to practice Zoom cultivation. But then this had a very severe consequences for the tribal communities. Now, in a letter or a petition which was given to the British government, the Baigas have written that we daily starve, having had no food grain in our possession. The only wealth we possess is our axe. We have no clothes to cover our body with, but we pass cold nights by the fireside. We are now dying of want of food. We cannot go elsewhere, as the British government is everywhere. What fault have we done that the government does not take care of us? Prisoners are supplied with ample food in jail. A cultivator of the grass is not deprived of his holding. But the government does not give us our right, who have lived here for generations past. So, it is a clear depiction that this deprivation in terms of accessing forests and this curtailment in terms of practicing Zoom cultivation have adverse economic impact in the lives of the Baigas, who actually were close to starvation. Now, a community which have produced enough for themselves till the coming of the British rule began to witness a severe decline, a deterioration in their economic life. So, therefore, they are saying that we are starving daily, having no food grain in our possession. So, tribal communities, despite the fact that Zoom cultivation may not resulted or created into a lot of produce at the end of the year, but then they produce enough for at least for their own consumption. So, what we see is that these policy changes in terms of accessing to forests resulted into severe economic crisis within tribal society. As a result of loss of cultural and traditional rights over the forest, several tribal groups such as Sauras of Gangam, Koya and Konda Dora tribes of Andhra Pradesh, Gons and Kolams of Hyderabad rose in resistance. Now, many tribal communities began to be very unhappy and dissatisfied with the way in which the colonial state was imposing new rules and regulations pertaining to forests. So, therefore, we begin to see a lot of resistance, a lot of struggles during the colonial period, where tribal communities have actually rose in protest against the new laws and regulations. The repeated protest and resistance by different tribal groups forced the colonial government in several provinces to adopt strategies to control the uprisings. For instance, in Madras Presidency, forest patches were set aside for tribes to practice Zoom cultivation. So, the economic deprivation resulted in a severe crisis, and it extended to political crisis as well. So, therefore, the colonial state was forced to rethink its policies in relation to forests, particularly when it comes to dealing with tribal communities. And in many parts of India, such as in Madras Presidency, what we see is that forest patches, some part of forest areas were being set aside for the community to practice Zoom cultivation. Also, to continue pursuing the commercial interest, Tongya method of agri-silviculture was adopted, where Zoom cultivation was allowed on the condition of growing timbers alongside. However, over time, Zoom cultivation largely died down and became unsustainable due to external forces. So, what we are seeing is that there was this effort to minimize harm, to minimize the impact, but then it was not enough, because probably because the impact and consequences, was already too, difficult to reverse. So therefore, what we see is that, despite the fact that the colonial state was trying to push, a new kind of policy changes following, the resistance, but then the fact that, Zoom cultivation, the practice of Zoom cultivation have also gradually died down, essentially also because lands were no longer available, because these lands were being usurped by the colonial state in the name of protecting forests. Now, what happened in the post-colonial period? Did the situation change for the better for tribal communities, particularly in relation to forest rights, particularly in terms of their access to forest resources, or is it that, there is a lot of continuity in terms of the stories when it comes to forest rights? A very important act one cannot miss when talking about forest rights in the post-colonial period is the Scheduled Tribes and Other Forest Dwellers, that is we also known as the Recognition of Forest Rights Act 2006. So this act was particularly important, and it received, there was a lot of enthusiasm, among tribal communities that it finally, the government has decided to recognize, the rights of tribal communities over forests. Now, the act actually, recognized the rights of the forest dwellers such as self-cultivation and habitation, that is recognize and provide ownership and land use rights. So, for the first time, the forest dwellers or the Forest Rights Act of 2006 actually recognize forest dwellers as such as self-cultivation and habitation, that people are actually living the forest, people actually rely on forest resources. So, there is this recognition of the rights of the people. It also recognizes community rights such as grazing, fishing, access to water bodies, habitat rights for PVTGs, that is particularly vulnerable tribal groups, traditional seasonal resource access of nomadic and pastoral community, because primarily they live on, they need, grazing lands, for their animals. So therefore, such kind of, recognition was also given even for communities like nomadic and, pastoral communities. Recognition of traditional customary rights and right to protect, regenerate or conserve or manage any commodity forest resource for sustainable use. Now, under this, the Forest Rights Act 2006, there was this mandate of setting up Forest Rights Committee to 8 Gram Sabhas to evaluate the claim made and verify the details. Now, through this act, people can actually make claim, in terms of that they have the right to access forest. This kind of claim will enable, people to reverse the process of, exclusion of community when it comes to accessing and controlling forest resources. Moreover, FRA also protects tribal population from eviction without rehabilitation and settlement. The Act further provides security from eviction from forest land till the time the verification of their rights is complete. Similarly, under Section 3, Clause 1 of FRA protects forest dwellers from eviction or displacement due to development projects without fair compensation. Now, if you look at the overall nature of the law, right, if you look at the overall nature of the Act, it is very good in a sense that, it guarantees, it protects, tribal communities from being evicted from forest lands, right, without proper rehabilitation and resettlement. It also protects, forest dwellers, from eviction or displacement due to development projects without fair compensation. And actually, it allows, communities to claim, claim rights, right. There is this mechanism actually which was being created, right, the Forest Rights Committee, which will actually look into the issues and verify the credibility of such claims. So now, if you look at, this statistic, this is just a statistics across India. There are a lot of, claims which were made by the community, by individuals, and different kind of land titles were also distributed. So it is up to us to really judge, whether this Forest Rights Act 2006, have lived up to its expectations, or whether or not, it doesn't really serve, the purpose it sets out to be. So as shown in the table, the implementation more or less one can say that, has been limited, with a significant number of claims being rejected. Additionally, there is a greater emphasis on individual claims, while community claims receive comparatively less attention. So we are, sticking more on the individual side. So the idea of, community owning resources, the idea of community ownership of land in contemporary context, continues to find less relevance, because people no longer abide, by this idea of community. So therefore, when it comes to, claims to forest titles as well, you see that, mostly it was individual claims which were being entertained by the state. The Joint Committee report of 2010 have found that major reasons for denying the claim is the absence of ST community certificates and the claimed land coming under the disputed category. The Joint Forest Management Program, which was another very important program that tried to bring in community in the management of forests, was launched in 1990 with the primary aim of protecting and regenerating the forests. The JFM seeks to form partnerships between forest departments and local users of forest by instituting Forest Protection Committee or Van Suraksha Samhita. Under JFM, villagers would get benefits from forest produce as a reward for assistance in protecting the forest. Now, from the 2006 onward, we begin to see different kind of change in terms of laws and regulations pertaining to forest. There are several other efforts, like in the case of this, the joint forest management, where the state try to integrate the community into the maintenance of forests, because for the state alone to protect forests is sometimes very difficult, right. But therefore, gradually there were efforts made by on the part of the government to actually bring the community into the management and protection of forests. However, a very important committee which was established, which submitted a report in 2014, which is now popularly known as the Khaka Committee, noted that the areas covered under JFM are mostly reluctant in implementing FRA. So, this is quite a very paradoxical situation, in a sense that the JFM was actually meant to bring in community, to actually take into confidence the community in the maintenance and protection of forests. But then the irony is that the areas covered under JFM particularly are the ones who are actually reluctant in implementing FRA. Now, we have come to the end of this lecture. So, in this lecture what we essentially try to understand was the process in which forests came to be regulated by the colonial state, and how in the process this resulted into economic deprivation of tribal communities. So, changes in forest laws and regulations does not only have economic impact, it also have a lot of socio-cultural impact. And like we have talked about and discussed also in this lecture, is that for many tribal communities in India, forests are not only economic resources. Forests have a lot of socio-cultural values. The belief system of tribal communities are largely rooted in their natural surroundings. So, therefore, any disruption in the forest resources also disrupts their socio-cultural life. At the same time, from the colonial period, we have seen that there is this continual negative portrayal of tribal communities, particularly practices like shifting cultivation. Now, since zoom cultivation or shifting cultivation requires tribal communities to look out for new patches of land periodically, maybe after 4, 5 or even 8 years. So, the colonial state projected it as something which is environmentally destructive. Now, therefore, tribal communities were forced to switch to different kind of occupations. This resulted into immense pauperization during the colonial period. Now, in the post-colonial period, there were definitely a lot of changes that were happening in the positive direction. However, many a times they were simply not enough. Many a times the implementation of these new laws and regulations are poor. But at the same time, what we also see is that there are a lot of resistant movements which are being launched by tribal communities, and at times there has to be some kind of adjustment to come out with a workable solution that will benefit the communities. So, in short, the kind of resources, the kind of resource rights that we are discussing, whether it was land in the previous class and forest, remains very, very central issue in the study and understanding of tribal communities in India. Thank you so much.